Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar, Navigating SEL from the Inside Out, Implications for Out-of-School Time Programs. We're incredibly excited about today's webinar and have some amazing speakers lined up for you all. We're hosting today's webinar in partnership with the Forum for Youth Investment in Every Hour Counts. So a huge thank you to their teams for helping us get this up and off the ground. Before we dive too far into the details, though, I do want to go over a few brief housekeeping notes. This webinar is being recorded, and afterwards we will send out presentation slides and resources mentioned. Go ahead and introduce yourself in chat. Let us know where you're from. Make sure your chat is set to everyone so that we can all converse together. And with that, I'm going to pass the proverbial microphone over to our Executive Director here at the Afterschool Alliance, Jody Grant, to provide some remarks and introduce our speakers for today. Jody.
Well, thank you so much, Tiara, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. This webinar comes at an absolutely critical moment for our kids. As we emerge from this pandemic, after-school programs across the country are seeing an increased need to support our young people who are struggling with anxiety, depression, trauma, and even homelessness. There's been an enormous amount of coverage on the news about academic loss, but not enough discussion about the impact of isolation and lost time with peers and caring adults and what that does to our kids. Parents, we know from multiple polls that we have done, are extremely concerned about these non-academic losses that are so critical to the physical and mental well-being of our children and youth. And they believe that these kinds of programming that happens in after school and the enrichment, the caring adults are absolutely essential to our students' recovery. That is why I am so excited that we have this webinar today to discuss the release of an updated version of Navigating Social and Emotional Learning from the Inside Out. It's a report from the Harvard Graduate School of Education's ESEL Lab. Funded by the Wallace Foundation, this report is going to provide all of us with much needed tools and resources to support our students. It also shows that after-school programs, and you're going to hear from one of them, can have significant benefits to children through the development of skills and behaviors like empathy, respect, conflict resolution, and managing emotions. I encourage all of you to check out the report, and we've put it in the chat box for you. Lots and lots of important information that you could use. And it's now my pleasure to introduce our speakers. Dr. Stephanie Jones is a Gerald S. Lesser Professor in Child Development and Education and Director of the ESEL Lab at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Cheryl Hollis is the Chief Program Officer for Wings for Kids. Wings for Kids is one of the evidence-based programs featured in the report. Kimberly Howard Robinson is an Executive Vice President of the Forum for Youth Investment and Managing Director of the Forum's Weichert Center for Youth Program Quality. She'll be moderating a discussion with our presenters and helping to facilitate your questions and answers at the end of the webinar. And last, before we move on to Dr. Jones's presentation, I want to pass the mic over to my friend and one of the co-hosts of this webinar, Jessica Donner, Executive Director of Every Hour Counts. Take it away, Jessica.
Oh, thanks so much, Jody. And thank you so much to the Afterschool Alliance for leading the effort to put this alliance together and including all of us. I just wanted to say hello and speak from our heart from Every Hour Counts. I'm the Executive Director of a coalition of 28 after-school organizations around the country. I'm seeing names in the chat from around the country, and hello to all of you for being here. And as Jody said, this is an unprecedented moment in our country. Our schools and after-school systems are facing a crisis like never before. We all know in the youth development space, we've long known how important social emotional learning is, and fortunate to have the Weichert, Kim Robinson from Weichert, sort of help moderate and lead that conversation given their work. But even more, when this first report was produced several years ago, I don't think we ever knew clearly it was critical, but just how critical it would be at this time. And so I just wanted to say thank you to the Wallace Foundation for their investment over many years in social emotional learning, particularly their elementary initiative, for supporting reports and resources like this to help communities that are overwhelmed and strapped and don't have the time and staff capacity to identify, which SEL curriculum they might use, what's most evidence-based, how to learn from peers and experts such as Dr. Jones and Cheryl Hollis, and to support reports and updates like this to keep the field moving forward. So just appreciate that. In the update, a couple of things that resonated for our community. One, the just recognition of the need for trauma-informed care and social emotional learning in communities, the emphasis on equity and social emotional learning, and just all the many resources. And just, I'm going to turn things over now to Dr. Jones. I'm just so grateful for all your work. We value it. It's being used in our communities around the country, and hope many more will learn so much more from this call today. And Cheryl, look forward to hearing from you in a moment too. So I'm going to turn things over now. So.
Hi, everyone. This is Stephanie Jones. It seems I'm unable to start my video because the host has stopped it. Do you think you can let me start the video to the host? Okay, here we go. There's always something that happens with Zoom that one doesn't completely predict. So thank you, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. I'm so happy to talk about this report, and I'm so grateful to all of you for joining us, and to those who put together this absolutely terrific webinar. And so now I'm going to see if I can actually share my screen successfully, and so you can all see the slides. Here we go. Okay, and now I'm going to play from the start. So I'm assuming that everyone can see them. So I'm just going to do a kind of whirlwind of information that is that crosses 5 areas. One area is just a level set on what social emotional learning really is and is about, and what we know about what works. That's the first thing. The second thing is I'm going to do kind of a breeze through the report, like what's in it and what's new in it. And then something about what SEL means and offers to us in the context of this pandemic, which its effects have been highlighted already. So I think what we can turn to is how SEL is such an important response to what we've experienced so far. What does all this mean for out of school time settings and organizations? And then a little ending part that's about the kind of frontiers of this work as we see them. So it is a whirlwind, and I'm going to go quickly because I want to make sure we have tons of time for Cheryl and for your questions. Okay, so what is social emotional learning? I find it helpful, as there is so much talk about different frameworks and different ideas that characterize what social emotional learning is, to just remember sort of the basic settings where children learn and play. And this might be a classroom setting, it might be an out of school time organization, it might be a community-based organization, it could be at home. And often there's some form of interaction between an adult or multiple adults and a group of children or youth, or just an interaction between a group of children. And it could be around a learning activity, it could be around a music lesson, it could be around art, it can be around any kind of specific activity. And just cast your head into the behavior and the mind of the children who are sitting here, but you can imagine any learning setting that is relevant to your work and the children who are there and the adults who are there. And just think about what it takes for that particular child or children to engage in the task that's going on in that setting. It requires not only listening to the words that are in this story and imagining what's going on in the story and learning about the language, let's say, and the content of what's going on there. It has to do with some other things that we all know are so important. It has to do with focusing and managing thinking, shifting attention from one thing to the next. So focusing attention on what's being said, what the pictures are showing, and then shifting attention to something else when it is needed. It is about managing behavior in a group. So being able to manage your physical behavior inside of that particular task so you can attend to the task itself. Building and holding positive relationships, establishing trust and comfort and feelings of safety and belonging in that setting that enable children and youth to have positive relationships with others. And then throughout it all, It's really about feelings and emotions, so understanding and dealing with feelings. So at its core, this is really what social and emotional learning is all about. And we see it in every interaction and in all the settings where children learn and grow. And so as we've looked across programs and strategies and all the things that support the work in the field, there are a few things that stand out as sort of the core ideas of what makes this, what makes the work in SEL effective. And it's really two things working in tandem with each other. The first is establishing safe and caring learning settings, really focusing on the place and the settings and establishing that it is safe, that children feel that they belong there, that they will find warmth and comfort. And then teaching, so teaching social and emotional skills directly in ways that engage students, engage children and youth, and support them to have some agency, some active role in the learning itself. And these two work in tandem. What's common across them and what's sort of foundational to all the work in SEL that we do are connected, supportive, reciprocal relationships. Children with adults, children with other children, adults with adults. And to really get to these essential things in social emotional learning, and I would say in other fields, we need to do a few things. To establish safe and caring learning settings, we really need to think about settings as settings. So what are the conditions that support the work? And also address broader systems of inequality, of oppression, and so on. And that's where SEL begins to intersect in really productive ways with other fields. And in this version of the guide, we've tried to distill some of those connections and highlight this concept of equitable SEL and how it gets instantiated in the programs that we reviewed. Instruction in social and emotional skills demands innovative ways of teaching. So innovative ways of teaching are all through the programs that we reviewed for this guide, and there are others out there. So it demands ways of teaching skills and supporting children to acquire skills and practice them in the places where they learn and grow in innovative ways. And then finally, connected, supportive relationships demand support for adults. So it demands that we really take seriously adult well-being and adult capacity building. So that's SEL. What's in this new guide? What's in the second edition of the Navigating SEL report? It begins, really in the same way. It's designed to be a practical resource for schools, for out-of-school time organizations, and now for early childhood education providers and anybody else who is interested and who is working in this big domain of SEL. We've, in this guide, added more programs to our review. We've included preschool programs, and we've included chapters that are focused on key areas that are rising up as really important to the work of SEL. And I'll go through a couple of those next. These are the 33 programs, some designed for in-school settings, some designed for out-of-school settings. And we selected programs based on a number of criteria, primarily that they included materials that we could actually code and really look at closely. And in the guide, all of this information is, of course, provided about our inclusion criteria, but also all of the things about each of the programs that are relevant to any particular stakeholder. So the guide itself includes 6 chapters: background on SEL skills and interventions, a focus on out-of-school time and navigating between in-school and out-of-school time and some tools for that, a chapter on equitable SEL, a chapter on trauma-sensitive approaches to SEL, and then a bunch of tables that compare programs to each other in a number of dimensions. And then for each program, a substantial, a many-page program profile that includes all the information you could imagine about each program, including a distillation of evidence. So we've also included in the guide a set of tools and supports for stakeholders who are using the guide to make decisions about what they might do in their particular setting. And this includes a sort of describing a program selection process that gets worked through a number of worksheets that can be downloaded and used in your setting to make decisions about what SEL work you'd like to do, what kind of program might be suitable, but also, if you're already doing work in SEL, how it might be enhanced or adapted to fit current needs. Just two things about these new chapters. In chapter 3, which is focused on achieving equitable SEL, we look closely at the fields that inform equitable SEL, and we produced a definition of it that makes sense in terms of the kinds of work that happens in social justice education, in culturally responsive pedagogy, in social emotional learning. And then the chapter itself highlights alignments among and between all of these fields. It defines equitable SEL. It includes a set of recommendations for achieving equitable SEL, and it does a kind of look at current programs and distills the extent to which they support equitable SEL. The chapter on a trauma-sensitive approach to SEL defines trauma-informed SEL. There's a lot of questions some of the time about the relationship between these two fields, and are they the same, and where are they different, and how can they operate in tandem? And we address that by providing a definition. And then in the chapter, we talk about the impact of trauma on social and emotional development, the alignment between the goals of social emotional learning and trauma-informed practice, and then, of course, a set of recommendations for ensuring that social emotional learning is trauma-informed. So that's a whirlwind through the guide. And now that just pivoting to social emotional learning in the context of the pandemic, I think the introductions that we heard highlighted how critical social emotional learning is right now, and the sort of what's real for children and families and for educators around the country, around the globe, who have really faced the pandemic and experienced the disruptions and the sort of the trauma that has gone along with it. And we've been doing a project in Massachusetts called the Early Learning Study at Harvard that we were doing for a number of years. And when the pandemic began, we shifted our approach in the study to gather information from families about how children are doing, from families about how families are doing, and from educators about how they're doing. And we've distilled that into a number of reports that kind of describe how families are doing, how children are doing, how educators are doing over time. So we began in March of 2020, and we've produced a number of reports over the year and a half since then, describing how it's going. And you can find all of these on the website if you just look up those titles, and we can make these resources available. The bottom line is that parents and educators, this is from the parent report, basically say, yes, our children's and the children we serve, their academic development has been affected by the pandemic in the negative direction, but also really critically their social and emotional development. And I hear from someone every single day about social emotional skills, about mental health and well-being, and real worry about not only what's happening for kids and adults, but also, on the other hand, what's going to be overlooked as we really worry about academic losses. And there's real fear that we might overlook some of these critical social and emotional skills as we leap to getting back these sort of losses. I'm not even sure I feel comfortable calling them losses in the academic domain, but that's something we can talk about in the question and answer. So the way I see it is social emotional learning and strategies is an essential, like the critical response right now. And that worry about learning loss is certainly important. But if we start by addressing children and adults' social and emotional needs, we'll accelerate the regains in these academic domains. And that we have to, again, remind ourselves that these areas are complements to each other. They work in tandem. They are not in competition with each other. So it's not an either or. Okay, so what does this all mean for out of school time? The whirlwind continues. The guide itself provides a set of principles and considerations for thinking about the bridge between in-school SEL work and out-of-school SEL work. And we use this kind of heuristic to make the bridge, which starts at the bottom with this notion that the underlying characteristics of social and emotional learning programs and the work of out-of-school time organizations is very similar. It's almost completely overlapping. At its core, it's about providing a safe and positive environment, about fostering and cultivating high quality relationships with adults, about delivering developmentally appropriate, relevant, and engaging activities and experiences, and providing opportunities for direct skill building. So with that in mind, the things we have to grapple with is how to ensure that across these two settings, children have experiences that are consistent, but not the same, right? So it's not just a repeat in the SEL world of what's happening in school and out of school, and how we align SEL work differently with the different missions of the two settings. And further, how we align the SEL work with the pedagogical strategy, the pedagogical work that is embedded in each setting, and how in each setting we carefully meet the needs students are presenting that might vary across those two settings. And then with all of that in mind, what are the strategies and the structures and the routines and activities that make sense? So one thing we absolutely know, and I'm certain everyone on this webinar knows this as well, is that children do better when they're exposed to ideas, strategies, tools, and experiences in all the places where they learn and grow. And so it really is an opportunity for SEL to do really high quality work in out of school time. Okay, so now to the end, some frontiers and ideas that come through all of this. We know that social and emotional skills and competencies are multifaceted. They are developmental, so they grow and change over time, and they're situated, they're rooted, their foundation is connected, supportive relationships and settings, all kinds of settings. Approaches that work, that are effective, build skills in targeted and relevant, so relevant to the setting, relevant to the child ways, and they cross between adults and children, and they can be used across settings. And then finally, my view of all of it is that the real frontier of doing work in SEL is to build it and scale it. And I think to do this, we need a clearer, at times, focus and really new approaches to intervention that are targeted, they're flexible, they're portable, they're engaging, and in some ways they're simplified and localized. And I would be happy to talk about those ideas more when we get to the questions. And right now I am going to turn it to Cheryl Hollis, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to go off video. And I just wanted to thank you all for joining us.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jones. I'm going to set up my screen as well. So hopefully you all are able to see my screen at this point, but I just want to take a second to say thank you for having me and for highlighting the work of Wings for Kids and many other OST programs who are doing wonderful work. As the Chief Program Officer at Wings, I started with Wings as a part-time college mentor, working within programs, leading and small groups of kids and teaching these important life skills, to now managing and training and leading staff and our mentors, our program leaders and managers across the states that we're in. And so my experience with Wings definitely gives me a unique perspective of all aspects of our after school program. But in thinking about the report, it calls out how Wings is different from other social emotional learning OST providers in three major ways. And I want to dive into some of the strategies behind each of these findings. The first being that Wings has the highest use of discussion than any other OST provider profiled. And I'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. Two, Wings offers an extensive culture and climate support in place. So we're in the top 18% there is profiled. And then three, Wings has a very intensive professional development and training process in which we focus on building adult social and emotional confidence, as well as the kids. So the foundation for everything that we say and do and teach in our programs is what we call our words to live by. It's like our mantra. It provides a common language that our staff and kids can relate to. Each phrase within the words to live by is almost like a mini lesson in itself. It summarizes one of the 5 core competencies in kid-friendly language that can be used to guide, behavior, the choices that they make, the interactions that they have, and just, responses to life circumstances. So each day at our program, we start with these words to live by. And then we have our curriculum. It is comprehensive in that it provides skill building opportunities across all of the 5 SE core competencies, like self-awareness, self-management, responsible decision-making, social awareness, and relationship skills. It's made up of 10 learning objectives, 2 objectives for each of the 5 core competencies, and they're supported by corresponding lessons, activities, and games, so all things kids love to do. The objectives and lessons are reinforced in small teachable moments that occur throughout the day, every day of the week that we're engaging with the students to really apply these lessons in real time. We also focus on, as I stated earlier, discussions. So we have large group discussions, but we also are intentional about small group discussions that focus on the topic or the week's lesson that we're presenting to the kids. And we implement these lessons through these small group discussions. And within these groups, we call them nests. And there's a wing staff member who leads that group in that discussion. And they utilize the curriculum to discuss real life relevant examples of SEL in action in their lives. So our staff are trained to both not only model, but also talk about SE skills in a relatable and equitable way. Our lessons explicitly our lessons explicitly are woven into all aspects of our program through teachable moments. We utilize things like conversation prompts, acknowledging behaviors that may occur, assigning tasks, or creating intentional opportunities for a lesson to be learned. Now, when thinking about SEL and then the culture and climate, and Dr. Jones spoke a little bit about the environment in which kids are learning and their ability to feel safe. So we know that SEL has never been more important. And right now in the United States, 1 in 5 children are experiencing mental health challenges like depression, behavioral problems, or anxiety. And a supportive culture and climate in OST programs gives kids a place where they can really just decompress, right? They can be themselves, they can share their feelings, and ultimately just feel safe. And so we build that sense of community through a component of our day called Community Unity. And the goal of that is to really encourage everyone to be themselves and become the best version of themselves and feel good about that. And then creating a community where everyone feels valued. And so when a child looks around the room, they know that they feel like they belong. And then ultimately, Community Unity is really about just setting the tone and making learning fun. And so if you can picture it, we have a large group of students who are in a space, and then they're broken down into these groups that we call nests, and these smaller circles or groups, usually by grade. Smaller ratios is what we typically stick to, which is usually about 1 to 10 to 12 students per adult. And the kids engage in Community Unity during this time, the small group discussions. They also engage in reinforcement activities. It's an opportunity for them to bond with one another, to build trust and relationships with their peers, and also the adult that is within that, mentoring that group. We also have a component of the community unity that's called Haze and Praise. And so this routinely occurs during community unity, but it's often a ritual during other parts of our day where sometimes it's a planned thing and sometimes it just happens naturally amongst the kids and the staff. But what it does, what Haze and Praise does is it encourages positive peer-to-peer feedback. And so ultimately you're acknowledging the good that we see in others' actions. So for example, the way it might work is I may say to a student, hey, we're going to pretend like the student's name is John. We're going to say, hey, John, can I give you some praise? And John would respond, yes, or sure. And I might say, hey, John, the other day when you came into community unity, super excited, you sat down with your group and you high-fived everyone. It really showed me that you were excited about being here and having some fun with your friends today. Thank you so much for spreading good vibes and energy, okay? So that would make John feel really good, but it will also just make John feel valued, feel like he is a part of something bigger than himself. And he's learning that positive interactions and the results from that. And so that is just something that we practice on a regular basis that any of, the OST providers on this call, you definitely can do yourselves at no cost to you. It can happen at any time of the day, any part of the day. We also focus our attention on in-school partnerships. So really having some intention on building relationships with school staff to support students in their learning is key. So just as the educators in a building might discuss the success and the supports that students need around their academics, we intentionally request feedback and have ongoing dialogue with the staff, administration, et cetera, in the building about the kids that we're serving in the program. And then lastly, what I wanted to touch on was family events. So really bringing the family into the picture. So throughout the year, we're hosting family events to provide support and resources that are based on their needs and the needs of the community. We also solicit feedback about what those needs are so that we're actually meeting them and meeting them where they are. And so with intention, we host these events. We make sure that they're fun and engaging. And we are very intentional about making sure that these events are a representation of the work that we do every day. So families get to see firsthand and hear and feel what it's like to really engage in our program. And ultimately, they're learning themselves from a social and emotional aspect. So it's really great to have our parents really understand that and buy into the work that we're doing. Now, when it comes to social and emotional learning and the adults, right? So we believe that you cannot teach what you don't know yourself. So we offer an intensive professional development and training, and it really builds on the adult's social and emotional confidence. So we intentionally train and grow specific SE skills in our staff so that they then in turn can model that within the program. So our staff training is very comprehensive in that our program staff at a minimum go through about 2 weeks of training. Yes, 2 weeks. It's more than 40 hours. And this is before they engage with any student. Oftentimes the topics might include things like, just the foundation. What is social and emotional learning? What does that look like? What does that sound like? We focus on personal development as well. So them being self-aware, them understanding what SE skills, look like for what those skills look like for them. And we do that through discussions and various skill builders. So very similar to what we might do with the kids during the Wings Day, we're doing that and reinforcing that with the adults as well. We're modeling various components of what our day looks like. So instead of just saying, hey, this is what we do, we actually make sure that our training consists of practice and implementation of that. We are making sure that we engage in topics such as being trauma informed, understanding various behaviors, age appropriate levels for interactions and things like that with youth, various behavior management techniques, both proactive and reactive, and really understanding and addressing the needs of the kids that we're actually serving at each of our sites. In addition to that, we have a high focus on coaching. So what we know is coaching is really engaging our staff in a way that we're having teachable moments in real time with them as well. And we know that this works. So we train our leadership staff to really have planned coaching moments, but also to have real time in the moment coaching with their staff. So just like we can continue to grow our emotional intelligence, and we encourage growth and adaptability with meeting expectations and goals and strengthening our work with our kids daily. And so having those conversations, really coaching our staff is our way of doing that. It's also a part of our culture at Wings where feedback is okay. And it's something that we celebrate. So whether it's positive or corrective, we know that it is welcomed and accepted by all. And it's how we challenge ourselves to continuously grow and evaluate. It's probably one of the most supportive things that we can do for one another is to really be accepting and almost have give each other and receive feedback, just like we might have a conversation with one another. And then lastly, just, overall, when it comes to coaching and training, when we have trained, confident adults who have intention and the best interests of the kids in mind, this directly helps kids address things like personal anxiety, trauma, and fear. They have a safe place to learn and engage in positive peer and mentor relationships, and just ultimately having fun and just being a kid. So again, so much attention around that because we know how important that is. We also have taken what we've learned over the last 25 years and developed trainings, PD, workshops, and resources for other OST providers so that they can implement SEL into their existing practices or adopt new SEL techniques. And so through our partnership with Discovery Education, we actually offer a free digital first resources designed to ensure equity of access in education, empowering all educators to integrate social and emotional learning in their programs, their classrooms, and beyond. So on my next slide, I actually have some information and how you might be able to access all of that. So here is a link, and it's my understanding that the slides will be sent out at a later time. I also have my contact information here as well. And so thank you so much again for having me. I hope that there were some little nuggets in there for those who are listening today on the webinar that might be helpful to you. And I'm going to turn things over to Kim Robinson for a panel discussion.
Thank you so much, Cheryl, for sharing. And Dr. Jones, I'd like to invite you to come back and join us as well. And we will just have a bit of opportunity to have a conversation. So we're gonna get started with that conversation. I've seen some questions come in the chat, but I wanna encourage folks to continue putting questions in the chat, and we'll incorporate those topics into our conversation as well. So I just really appreciated these two presentations next to each other, getting to hear sort of the scientific perspectives and definitions of what social and emotional learning is and how social and emotional skills really support learning, and that there's it's both something that young people experience in their learning environment, as well as something that they can be taught explicitly, and how those two things sort of go together and are so important. And hearing about kind of the concepts and then how that is really operationalized in the Wings for Kids program is so helpful to kind of have that experience of how there's the adult training and the focus on climate, as well as the lessons and experiences that are intentional for young people. So I want to get us into conversation and really have a chance to dig more into what this looks like in practice. We promised in the description of this session that we would be talking about cost-effective strategies for improving SEL in any program. And I know that there are a lot of folks on this session who are going to be going back into programs tomorrow, next week, or who will watch it later because they're working with young people right now. And so would love to have you share some examples of what SEL practices can look like in practice.
So if it would be helpful, I'll start. Just one thing to remember or to note about effective SEL, if you look across all the programs and you kind of distilled the things across them that are common, like the common ways of doing SEL work, it really ends up boiling down to four things. That adults model the behaviors they would like to see. Adults are living what they are hoping children will learn. So there's strategies that are about supporting adults themselves to engage in these skills. There's teaching, right? So there's activities and strategies that are about teaching skills directly. There's opportunities to practice. So Cheryl mentioned teachable moments. Those are opportunities to practice skills, and they happen at all times in all places. And then having a language of SEL in interactions and in settings. So if you're thinking about what to do next, you might think, okay, here are four things. What is one thing of those four that we're really doing right now, and how can we expand it, or how can we intensify it, or how can we add another thing? We in the lab, we've been thinking about, concrete scalable strategies, and we've developed a host of strategies that we call SEL kernels that are sort of derived from what is common across all of these programs. And you can find examples of them on the Berkeley Greater Good Science website. If you Google SEL kernels and Greater Good Science Center, they will come up. And there's 5, but more than that, examples. But there's strategies you could do on Monday. You could do tomorrow, and they include things like executive function and self-regulation games that take a short period of time but are very targeted and about building those skills. A feeling circle, which is something that is inside of many effective programs, is just having a circle in a time where adults and children can share how they feel, or not, but they have a chance to if they want to. So I think there are lots of places where strategies you can start with tomorrow are available. Someone is very fast in the chat, putting links to things. It's amazing. Cheryl, I'll turn it to you.
Yes, no, I think you threw out a lot of great points. In my presentation, I mentioned earlier the haze and praise, which is just a really quick, routine thing that you can do in your program at any time. It takes no time. It can happen anytime. Something else that we do that's a really great ritual that we have in our program that anybody can implement, it's called Good News. And so it is very topic based, but say you want to focus your attention on a specific skill or lesson or something you really want the kids to take away. You want to make sure that you target that question in that area. So if we are focused on loving and accepting ourselves and sharing our emotions and being okay with that, right? We might ask the question of, can you think about a time or a situation today where you might have felt nervous? Or can you share with me today a time where you felt excited and why? And so it really is prompting the kids to really have that safe place that they can have those conversations. They can hear from their peers. They can feel validated in their own emotions and that they can share those emotions and give it a name. Because oftentimes kids don't also know how to explain that, right? And so then they begin to hear different, emotion words. And can we talk to, have the adults make sure that they are challenging the kids to think outside of the typical, I'm feeling happy or I'm feeling sad. Those are great emotion words, but there's so much more, right? And so really opening them up to the vocabulary that they can use to do that. So something as simple as good news can start there and expand itself so much deeper and further than that. So that would just be one little tidbit or something that I would share that would be easy for you guys to do.
Thank you so much. I love how specific those things were. And I also really appreciated in the haze and praise example, the opportunity to practice those emotion words also. Like it wasn't just, hey, praise around, I like your shirt today, but really thinking about opportunities to describe social and emotional skills and identify those for young people, and for young people to be able to identify them for one another. One of the important things that I heard in both of your presentations was about the need to be explicit about equitable SEL and how SEL skills can support trauma-sensitive approaches as well. I know a lot of programs aren't super explicit about how that works, but we're grappling with this, how to become more explicit and be intentional about bringing equity into our SEL approaches. And so I'm just wondering if there are resources, examples that come to mind around really strengthening equitable practices in SEL.
The guide has some illustrations of practices that we would describe as being oriented toward equitable SEL. We've also written a paper that is practice oriented in Frontiers of Education. Of course, I think someone's going to now Google it and put it in the chat. I hope. I can't remember what it's called, but I would be happy to figure that out and share it. And it's really focused on highlighting example practices that are consistent with this idea of equitable SEL. And I saw a couple of questions in the Q&A and in the chat about this whole set of issues. There was one question about what is equitable SEL in relation to transformative SEL, and there was one about how SELs can be occasionally deployed as a sort of tool for compliance. And both of those are really important conversations to have. I'm not sure we can have the entire conversation right now, but at its core, equitable SEL is about ensuring that in the places where all children grow and learn, they feel that they belong, they feel that they are safe, they feel that they are noticed, that they are seen and heard, and that their needs will be met. In addition to that, there are ways of thinking about SEL as sort of learning skills that help you navigate the things as they are, and learning skills that help you change the things that need to be changed. And different versions of SEL fall into these different categories more or less. And so there's a real opportunity for frontiers of SEL work to think hard about how are we ensuring in our programming that we are enacting practices that make each and all children feel that they are safe, that they belong, that they are noticed and seen, and that their needs are met, and that they have tools to identify systems of power and oppression and might have some strategies to shift those over time. I think that that's what we are all seeking, however we define it. And so I think it's really important to make explicit and to talk about.
Oh goodness, that was so much to follow. You touched on so much. I think the biggest thing that I could probably mention here is going back to the adults and the intention that the adults have, but starting with their understanding of where they are, right? So we as adults sometimes come with our own internal biases. and we have our own strengths, our own weaknesses, and making sure that we are seeking understanding and navigating those and really pushing our, challenging ourselves to grow socially and emotionally. We're able to build those relationships in which we can, understand more about the students that we work with. We can be intentional about the images that we display. We can, consider language. We can just really think about the content that we share with our kids and making sure that it's representation of them and their culture, their ethnicity, et cetera. So I think it's really just, starting with the adults and us really recognizing, okay, what place are we coming from? But then also just having an intention about understanding where our children are, their backgrounds, what kinds of things that they experience in their, whether it's in their household, within their community, et cetera. Yeah.
Thank you so much for those examples. I was remembering in your presentation, Cheryl, you said you can't teach what you don't know yourself, and that really being a guiding principle for supporting adults, and helping us to think about the fact that there's different starting points for the adults in this work. And so depending on where those starting points are, we have different challenges and different opportunities in the work. I want to shift to asking audience questions because there have been so many wonderful ones come in, and we only have so much time. And so first, just sort of a broad question about sort of the age ranges that this work applies to. So I think most of the programs have in the guide are for elementary age, pre-K to 5 grades. But do these principles apply in middle school and high school? And what other resources are available in that older age range as well?
So SEL and its components are relevant to everyone across development. So it's in all the interactions that we have. We're using them right now as we have this webinar. So it's an ageless phenomenon. How it looks and how it manifests varies over time for sure, and in different settings. The guide so far is pre-K to grade 5. So 3 to 4 years old to age 10, roughly. We're in the middle of creating a parallel guide for middle school and high school, and that will come out in late spring. And there was in the chat a tag to the Preparing Youth to Thrive guide, which is an incredible resource for middle school, high school aged youth, and I highly recommend it. I spent hours pouring through it, thinking about how it's organized and how things are showcased. And it's really great. So.
Always encouraged talking about preparing youth to thrive. I want to ask another question. Cheryl, I'll direct this one to you first. Thinking about, we know that a lot of times these skills develop over time, right? And that what it looks like when we're supporting SEL with really young children kind of changes, and from what that looks like with a little bit older kids. How are you measuring your progress in Wings for Kids? How do you sort of know when you're making progress and when you need to change it up a little bit to improve?
So we use an assessment tool to do that, but we also, actually two. One of them is very well known. It's called the DESA, which is the Devereaux Student Strengths Assessment tool. We do a pre and post assessment. Not only do our staff complete that assessment, we have the teachers within the school building also complete that assessment. We have an internal measuring tool that is what we call our Objective Knowledge Assessment, or OKA for short. And so as we transition through our learning objectives each trimester, they build upon the next. And so we, over the course of the entire year, we're looking for their understanding of what we teach. And then the DESA obviously focuses on how they actually are carrying out what we teach, right? And so We utilize those two things. We are also constantly assessing the climate and culture of our programs. And we do that through a framework that we have in place that we train all of our staff on. We actually have a workshop that's available to individuals externally, but it's called the SET approach. And it's really about adults supporting, engaging, and teaching, and what that looks like. So at any given time, you know, wherever you are, and if you're an adult engaging in the program, we can measure what if supportive behaviors are taking place, how engagement is taking place, if learning is taking place. And so over time, we're always kind of, you know, doing those pulse checks along the way. And so we use a number of measurement tools actually to do that. But I would also like to point out that even when you don't have a measurement tool, there are things that you can recognize, right? And it's not always the big things. It's really sometimes just the small little things. So if you think about the kid who, whenever there's, you know, it's time to shift to doing academic hour, right? And OST time, sometimes doing homework is not the fun part. And you might have the kid who, oh, they get down and out, or they get really upset because that's not really what they want to do. They really want to instead maybe go and have some enrichment or play or fun time. But if you can get that child from doing that every day to maybe only once or twice a week, that is proof, that is change, that is a shift. And so even acknowledging just those small moments, you don't need an assessment tool to tell you that, right? And so just really being cognizant of that and taking that in and saying, hey, this is growth, this is change, this is something that we really can see, and therefore we can measure that it's working, right? Yeah.
That makes me think of the opportunities for reflection. That was one of the things in the report that really, you know, sort of was called out, that opportunities for adults to be able to reflect, and also supporting young people to be able to reflect on their emotional experiences. Dr. Jones, I wonder if you have anything to add around measurement. There's all kinds of, you know.
we need many webinars
Right,
to talk about all these important topics.
Yeah.
So the measurement, I mean, I think it's a very complicated territory, and I couldn't agree more with Cheryl. There are ways that there are assessment tools that you can use. Ideally, they would be very closely aligned with like the actual practices. And then there's the everyday, right? There's the kinds of things that we notice in the everyday that give us a sense of how the work we're doing is making a difference. And I think one of the interesting things that we know from research is that just the practice of noticing, like looking closely and spending time noticing what's happening, is a step along the path to changing the behaviors and the skills and the competencies that we're observing. So there's something about the art of noticing. And Cheryl gave a really good example of an everyday opportunity to notice something that's shifting. And I think it's important to think about both the kind of tools, like the things that we can get from maybe the RAND repository of assessment tools. That's one place to find those. That's one thing, but also like, what are the things we're gonna support ourselves to see in the setting we're in? And what's that small number of things we just want to pay attention to? And let's write them down and notice them every day, and then see where we are. So both of those are important ways to gather information.
That's really helpful. Thank you. And that idea of sort of noticing, being intentional about noticing and thinking about those practices, I might also suggest the social and emotional learning program quality assessment, which we can also share the link for that. But yes, it also has a listing of, you know, of things that you can use to notice and to be intentional about, whether you use the whole entire tool or just identify some of the practices that you want to be intentional about with your staff. I know we are close to time, but I have one more question that's probably a little bit juicy that I really want to get in before we leave, and that is, you know, we talked about how, you know, how parents and teachers are concerned about young people's social and emotional well-being, but also their mental health, and that 1 in 5 children are experiencing mental health challenges, and really, the importance of coaching both adults and young people around social and emotional well-being, but also identifying where, what is sort of the edge of what is social emotional learning and where are mental health supports needed. And so would love to just hear some thoughts about, the realities of that's such a need right now, but how can folks know how to engage resources for when the challenge is beyond just social and emotional learning?
That is a great question. I mean, I think that strategies and supports that are embedded in social emotional learning programs, the kind of universal stuff that's in SEL programs, goes a long way, right? So it because it's universal, it is likely to support and offset many young people and adults sort of flip over to sort of more significant mental health challenges. And so thinking about a strategy and taking it seriously in a setting is really important and can make a difference. But it's not going to take care of everything for everyone, as you note, that people are really facing significant challenges right now. And that's where we need to draw in other resources from those who have expertise in mental health and well-being, like school counselors, for example, or others who can step in and respond with something that's in the kind of tier 2 realm. And I'm not sure we have time for like all of the types of things that those resources might be, but we can certainly offer suggestions. It's different in every place, of course.
Cheryl, I'd love to give you the last word, just in terms of how you're supporting children in real time in your programs, and some of the things that you're finding encouraging about the opportunity in this moment.
Oh goodness. So we've, obviously within the pandemic, we've had to really just switch things up in a lot of ways. And we've just learned so much about the work that we're doing. And if anything, it just rang the bells even louder that, oh my goodness, what we're, this focus on social and emotional learning it's just really needed. And it, even in the pandemic and the virtual, things that we were offering to our students and our families, we stayed kind of focused on, what we are at the core. And we know that it helped. We had kids logging on even after virtual school to be a part of, just, feeling like they could, get away even though they were on a screen. I just ultimately think that if we can all push ourselves to think outside of the box to continue this work now more than ever, we definitely need to collaborate, educate ourselves as much as possible, continue to push the limits, advocate for this work, and equip everyone everywhere with the skills, the strategies, the resources. So yeah, we just need to continue to connect, continue to talk about these things. And so I just want to thank everyone so much for pulling this together, because this was a great opportunity for all of us.
Agreed. That's a great last word. Well done.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you to both of you for sharing and this wonderful discussion. Thank you to all of our participants for joining us today. As we wrap up, I just want to remind you that this was recorded. I also see the live on Facebook note. So you'll, Afterschool Alliance will be following up with a link to the recording and to the slides from the presentations and to all the resources that have been shared in the chat. And on behalf of the Forum for Youth Investment, Every Hour Counts, and Afterschool Alliance, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.